My name is John, and I'm about to share a story that has haunted me for the past 2 years. I'm 20 now, but the events I'm about to describe took place when I was 18, during my senior year of high school. I've debated whether or not to share this experience, but I feel like I need to get it off my chest. Maybe by writing it down, I can finally start to make sense of what happened. Or maybe, just maybe, someone out there has experienced something similar and can help me understand. Either way, I need to tell this story. It all began on a crisp autumn day in September. The leaves were just starting to turn, painting our small town in hues of red and gold. I remember thinking how beautiful it all looked as I walked to school that morning, completely unaware of the horrors that awaited me. I attended Westfield High, a fairly typical American high school nestled in the heart of a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was an old building, constructed in the 1950s, with long corridors and classrooms that had seen generations of students pass through. There was nothing particularly remarkable about it, at least not on the surface. That day started like any other. I arrived at school, chatted with my friends before the bell rang, and headed to my first class. It wasn't until lunchtime that things began to feel off. I was sitting in the cafeteria with my best friend Mike when I first noticed it. A strange silence had fallen over the usually noisy room. It was subtle at first, just a slight dip in the volume of chatter. But as I looked around, I realized that several students were staring blankly into space, their food untouched in front of them. "Hey, Mike," I whispered, nudging my friend. "Is it just me, or is something weird going on?" Mike looked up from his phone, glancing around the room. "What do you mean?" "Look at Sarah," I said, nodding towards a girl a few tables away. Sarah was known for being one of the most talkative students in our grade, always surrounded by a group of friends. But now she sat alone, her eyes fixed on a point in the distance, her expression vacant. Mike shrugged. "Maybe she's just tired. You know how it is with all these college applications and stuff." I wanted to believe him, but something in my gut told me this was different. As we continued eating, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every few minutes, I'd catch a glimpse of someone staring in our direction, only to quickly look away when I met their gaze. The rest of the day passed in a blur of unease. In my classes, I noticed more students with that same blank stare. Even some of the teachers seemed affected, pausing mid-sentence as if they'd forgotten what they were saying. By the time the final bell rang, I was more than ready to go home. As I was gathering my books from my locker, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned to find Mr. Thompson, my history teacher, standing behind me. "John," he said, his voice oddly flat, "I need you to stay after school for a bit. There's something we need to discuss." A chill ran down my spine. Mr. Thompson had always been one of my favorite teachers, known for his animated lectures and friendly demeanor, but the man standing before me now seemed like a shell of his former self. His eyes were dull, and his usual smile was nowhere to be seen. Sure," I replied, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "What's this about?" "Just come to my classroom in 10 minutes, he said, then turned and walked away without another word. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding. Part of me wanted to just leave, to run home and forget about this strange day. But curiosity got the better of me. Besides, I reasoned, what could possibly happen in a school full of people? How wrong I was. 10 minutes later, I knocked on Mr. Thompson's classroom door. There was no answer, but I could hear movement inside. I took a deep breath and turned the handle. The room was dark, the blinds drawn despite the afternoon sun outside. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw Mr. Thompson standing at the front of the room. But he wasn't alone. Seated at the desk were about a dozen students, all with that same vacant expression I'd seen in the cafeteria. Among them, I recognized Sarah, the girl from lunch, and a few others from my classes. "Close the door, John," Mr. Thompson said, his voice eerily calm. I did as I was told, my hands shaking as I turned the lock. As soon as the click echoed through the room, the atmosphere changed. The air seemed to thicken, and I could feel a pressure building in my ears. "We've been waiting for you," Mr. Thompson continued. "It's time for you to join us." "Join you?" I stammered. "What are you talking about?" That's when I noticed the object on Mr. Thompson's desk. It looked like an old radio, but instead of dials and buttons, it was covered in strange symbols that seemed to shift and change as I looked at them. Mr. Thompson placed his hand on the device, and a low hum filled the room. The students at the desk began to twitch and convulse, their eyes rolling back in their heads. I backed up against the door, fumbling for the handle, but before I could turn it, Sarah stood up and grabbed my arm. Her grip was inhumanly strong, her fingers digging into my flesh. "Don't fight it, John," she said, but her voice wasn't her own. It was deeper, older somehow. "It's easier if you don't resist." I tried to pull away, but more students were standing now, surrounding me. Their faces were contorted into grotesque smiles, their eyes completely black. Mr. Thompson stepped forward, the strange device in his hands. "You've been chosen, John. You should feel honored. Not everyone gets to be a part of what's coming." "What's coming?" I managed to choke out. His smile widened, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. "The awakening. The old ones are returning, and they need vessels. Young, strong vessels like you." The humming from the device grew louder, and I felt a pressure building in my head. It was as if something was trying to force its way into my mind, to take control. I screamed, more out of defiance than fear, and with a surge of adrenaline, I managed to break free from Sarah's grip. I shoved my way through the crowd of possessed students, their hands clawing at me as I passed. I reached the door and fumbled with the lock, my fingers slipping on the metal. Behind me, I could hear Mr. Thompson chanting in a language I didn't recognize, his words seeming to echo and distort in the small room. Finally, the lock turned, and I burst out into the hallway. I ran as fast as I could, not daring to look back. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. It was as if the school itself was trying to keep me trapped. I could hear footsteps behind me getting closer. The chanting grew louder, seeming to come from the very walls around me. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I saw the exit. With a final burst of speed, I crashed through the doors and out into the fading daylight. I didn't stop running until I reached my house, locking the door behind me and collapsing on the floor, gasping for breath. For the next week, I refused to go back to school. I told my parents I was sick, faking a fever and staying in bed. When they finally insisted I return, I was terrified of what I might find. But when I walked into Westfield High that Monday morning, everything seemed normal. Mr. Thompson greeted me with his usual friendly smile, showing no sign of recognition about what had happened. Sarah and the other students who had been in that room acted as if nothing was amiss. For a while, I managed to convince myself that it had all been some sort of vivid hallucination. Maybe I'd been working too hard, or maybe someone had slipped something into my drink at lunch that day. But then the nightmares started. Every night I would find myself back in that darkened classroom. Sometimes I was tied to a chair, forced to watch as my classmates transformed into monstrous creatures. Other times, I was the one changing, feeling my body twist and contort as something ancient and evil took control. I would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, the echo of that strange chanting still ringing in my ears. As the weeks passed, I started noticing other things. Small changes in the people around me. A teacher's eyes flashing black for just a moment. A student speaking in that same ancient language under their breath. The way the shadows in the hallways seemed to move when no one was looking. I tried to talk to Mike about it, but he just laughed it off. "Man, you've been watching too many horror movies," he said. But I could see the fear in his eyes, the way he quickly changed the subject. I knew then that I wasn't the only one who had seen something, but no one wanted to talk about it. It was easier to pretend everything was normal, to ignore the darkness that was slowly seeping into our school. As my senior year progressed, the incidents became more frequent. Students would disappear for days, only to return with no memory of where they'd been. Strange symbols would appear carved into desks overnight, only to vanish by morning. The air in the school grew heavy with a sense of impending doom. I tried to investigate, to find some explanation for what was happening. I spent hours in the library, researching local history and occult legends. What I found chilled me to the bone. Westfield hadn't always been the quiet suburban town it was now. Centuries ago, it had been the site of a Native American settlement. According to the old records, the tribe had been wiped out in a single night, with no explanation given. The land had remained uninhabited for years, considered cursed by the neighboring tribes. When the first European settlers arrived, they reported strange phenomena. Whispers in the night, shadowy figures that vanished when approached, and an overwhelming sense of dread that permeated the area. The town had been built anyway, with our high school constructed right on top of what was believed to be an ancient burial ground. As I read this, I remembered the strange twisting corridors I had run through that day, how the school had seemed to come alive around me. But the most disturbing information came from a dusty old book I found hidden in the back of the library. It spoke of an ancient entity, a being of immense power that had been worshipped by the original inhabitants of the land. This entity, known only as the Sleeper, was said to awaken every 100 years, requiring human vessels to fully manifest in our world. The last awakening, according to the book, had been in the 1920s, which meant we were due for another. As I connected the dots, a horrifying realization dawned on me. The strange behavior, the possessions, the inexplicable events, it was all leading up to something big, and it was centered on our school. I tried to warn people, but no one would listen. My parents thought I was having some kind of breakdown and suggested I see a therapist. The school counselor gave me pamphlets about stress and anxiety. Even Mike, my best friend, started avoiding me. I was alone, armed only with the knowledge of what was coming and the terrifying certainty that I couldn't stop it. As the end of the school year approached, the atmosphere in Westfield High became unbearable. The air felt thick and oppressive, like the moments before a massive storm. More and more students were falling into that eerie, trance-like state. Teachers would stop mid-lesson, their eyes going blank for minutes at a time before continuing as if nothing had happened. I started carrying the old book with me everywhere, desperately searching for some way to prevent what I knew was coming. But every potential solution I found seemed impossible. How could I, a single high school student, possibly hope to stop an ancient, malevolent entity? The night before graduation, I couldn't sleep. The air in my room felt electric, charged with an otherworldly energy. As I tossed and turned, I heard a faint whisper coming from somewhere in the darkness. "John, John, it's time." I sat up, my heart pounding. The voice seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I fumbled for the light switch, but nothing happened when I flicked it on. Suddenly, my room was illuminated by an eerie, pulsating glow. It was coming from under my door, seeping in like some kind of luminescent fog. As I watched, paralyzed with fear, the door slowly creaked open. Standing in the doorway was Mr. Thompson, but it wasn't really him anymore. His skin was pale and translucent, his eyes completely black. When he spoke, his voice was a chorus of 1,000 whispers. "The Sleeper awakens John, and you will be its herald." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was frozen in place as Mr. Thompson, or whatever was wearing his skin, approached my bed. Behind him, I could see more figures. My classmates, my teachers, even my parents. All of them moved with an unnatural fluidity, their faces blank masks. As they surrounded my bed, I felt that same pressure in my head from months ago. But this time, it was stronger, much stronger. I could feel something ancient and cold trying to force its way into my mind. In that moment, I understood. This wasn't just about possession or awakening some dormant entity. The Sleeper wasn't just trying to enter our world, it was trying to remake it in its image. With the last of my willpower, I reached for the old book I'd kept by my bedside. As my fingers touched its worn leather cover, there was a flash of blinding light. I found myself standing in a vast empty space. No up, no down, just an endless expanse of swirling colors and shapes that hurt my eyes to look at directly. And in the center of it all was something, a presence so vast and alien that my mind couldn't begin to comprehend it. "I have waited so long," a voice boomed in my head. It wasn't really a voice, more like the concept of communication forced directly into my consciousness. "What are you?" I managed to ask, my own voice sounding small and insignificant in this impossible space. "I am the end and the beginning, the Sleeper and the Awakener, and you, John, are the key." Images flashed through my mind. I saw civilizations rise and fall in the blink of an eye. I saw worlds born and die. And through it all, I saw this entity, this Sleeper, manipulating events from the shadows. Why? I asked, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of what I was witnessing. Why do all this? Existence is a cycle, John. Creation and destruction, sleep and awakening. Your world has grown stagnant. It must be remade. I understood then. This wasn't evil, not in the way we understood it. This was a force of nature, as implacable and unstoppable as time itself. And it had chosen our small town, our high school, as the focal point for its reemergence. But as this realization washed over me, another thought surfaced. The book, the one I'd found in the library, the one that had brought me here. You're not unstoppable, I said, surprising myself with the strength in my voice. You've been stopped before. That's why you need us, why you need me. The presence seemed to recoil slightly, and I felt a wave of something almost like surprise emanate from it. Clever child. But knowledge is not power. You cannot stop what has already begun. Maybe not, I admitted, but I can try. With all my will, I focused on the book, on the knowledge it contained. I thought of my friends, my family, my town, of all the normal, everyday moments that made life worth living, the very things this entity sought to destroy in its quest for renewal. There was a sound like reality itself tearing apart, and suddenly I was back in my room. The figures were gone, and the first light of dawn was peeking through my window. For a moment I thought it had all been a dream, but then I saw the book on my lap, its pages glowing with an inner light, and I knew that whatever had happened, whatever I had done, it wasn't over. The day of graduation dawned bright and clear. As I put on my cap and gown, I couldn't shake the feeling that something momentous was about to happen. The air still felt charged, like the calm before a storm. At the ceremony, I looked out at the sea of faces. My classmates, my teachers, my family. How many of them were still themselves? How many were now vessels for that ancient, unknowable entity? As I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I locked eyes with Mr. Thompson. For a split second, I saw a flicker of that otherworldly blackness in his gaze, a reminder that the threat was still very real. But then I felt the weight of the book in my pocket, and I stood a little straighter. I didn't know how, but I had pushed back the awakening. I had bought us some time. As I shook the principal's hand and accepted my diploma, I made a silent vow. I would find a way to stop this, to protect my town, my world from the horrors that lurk just beyond the veil of reality. The sleeper may have chosen me as its herald, but I chose to be its adversary. And as I looked out at the crowd, at the mix of blank stares and proud smiles, I knew that the real battle was just beginning. The war for the soul of Westfield High, for the very fabric of our reality, had only just begun. And I, John, an ordinary high school student turned reluctant hero, was right at the center of it all. As I walked off the stage, diploma in hand, I couldn't help but wonder, how many graduations had this entity witnessed? How many cycles of sleep and awakening had it gone through? And more importantly, how could I ensure that this would be its last? The summer after graduation was a strange time. On the surface, everything seemed normal. People went about their lives, enjoying the warm weather and making plans for the future. But underneath it all, there was a tension, a sense that something wasn't quite right. I spent those months diving deeper into my research, trying to understand more about the sleeper and how to stop it. The book I had found became my constant companion, its pages seeming to reveal new information every time I opened it. I learned that the sleeper's influence spread in waves, like ripples in a pond. Westfield High had been the epicenter, but the effect was slowly spreading outward. People in town were starting to exhibit the same strange behavior I had seen in my classmates. Blank stares, speaking in tongues, moments of lost time. But I also discovered something else. The book wasn't just a source of information, it was a tool, a weapon even. The more I read it, the more I could sense the ebb and flow of the sleeper's power. And sometimes, if I concentrated hard enough, I could push back against it. It wasn't much. Maybe I'd see someone snap out of a trance-like state, or a strange symbol etched into a wall would fade away. Small victories, but they gave me hope. As summer turned to fall, I made a difficult decision. I had been accepted to several colleges, but I knew I couldn't leave Westfield. Not now, when the threat was still so present. So I enrolled in the local community college, taking classes part-time while I continued my secret war against an enemy most people didn't even know existed. It was a lonely existence. My parents worried about me, convinced that I was throwing away my future. My friends, those who hadn't been fully taken over by the sleeper's influence, drifted away as they left for college or started their careers. But I couldn't give up. The stakes were too high. One crisp October evening, about a year after that fateful day in Mr. Thompson's classroom, I found myself back at Westfield High. The school was hosting a community event, and I thought it might be a good opportunity to gauge how far the sleeper's influence had spread. As I walked through the familiar hallways now decorated with fall-themed artwork and flyers for various clubs, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air seemed to thicken, and I could hear that faint, otherworldly humming that I had come to associate with the sleeper's presence. I made my way to the gymnasium, where most of the event was taking place. As I pushed open the double doors, the sound hit me like a physical force. Hundreds of people, from young children to the elderly, all chanting in that same ancient language I had heard Mr. Thompson use. In the center of the gym, where the basketball hoop should have been, was a swirling vortex of darkness. And emerging from it, bit by bit, was something that defied description. A mass of writhing tentacles, eyes that opened and closed at random, a body that seemed to exist in more dimensions than our reality could handle. The sleeper was awakening, and I was the only one who could see it for what it was. I reached into my pocket, my fingers closing around the worn leather cover of the book. As I touched it, I felt a surge of energy course through me. The chanting faltered for a moment, and several people in the crowd turned to look at me with those horrible black eyes. "John," a voice said behind me. I turned to see Mr. Thompson, his face a mask of false concern. "We've been waiting for you. It's time to take your place." "No," I said, surprised by the strength in my voice. "This ends now." I pulled out the book and held it high. The reaction was immediate. The swirling vortex pulsed, and a sound like 1,000 screaming voices filled the air. The people in the crowd began to convulse, some falling to the ground while others advanced towards me with inhuman speed. I began to read from the book, my voice somehow carrying over the chaos. I didn't understand the words, but I could feel their power. With each syllable, the vortex seemed to shrink, the monstrous form of the sleeper being pulled back into whatever dark dimension it had come from. Mr. Thompson lunged at me, his face contorting into something no longer human. I ducked under his grasp and continued reading, pouring every ounce of will I had into the words. The gym was in pandemonium. Those under the sleeper's control were fighting against those who were starting to wake up, confused and terrified. The vortex was spinning faster now, creating a wind that whipped through the room, tearing down decorations and toppling tables. As I reached the final words of the incantation, I locked eyes with the mass of tentacles and eyes that was the sleeper. For a moment, I felt its ancient consciousness touch my mind. "You cannot defeat me, John. I am eternal. I am inevitable." Maybe, I thought back, but not today, and not here. With a final shout, I slammed the book shut. There was a blinding flash of light, a sound like reality itself tearing apart, and then silence. I opened my eyes to find the gym in ruins. People were slowly getting to their feet, looking around in confusion. The vortex was gone, and with it, any sign of the sleeper's physical form. But I knew it wasn't over. I could still feel it, lurking just beyond the veil of our reality. Weakened, yes, pushed back, certainly, but not defeated, not yet. As sirens sounded in the distance, and people began to ask questions I knew I couldn't answer, I slipped out of the gym. My war wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The sleeper was still out there, and it would try again. Maybe not here, maybe not for another 100 years, but it would be back. And when it did, someone would need to be ready. That someone, I realized, was me. John, the reluctant guardian of reality, the boy who had looked into the face of an eldritch horror and lived to tell the tale. As I walked home through the dark streets of Westfield, the book tucked safely under my arm, I couldn't help but smile grimly. High school had been hell, quite literally, but compared to what lay ahead, it might just have been the easy part. The true horror, the real test was yet to come, and I would be ready.